Eventually, I realized that what I really loved was books, not just being an analyst. And in the time after that, I wrote more books there, collaborated on them with other analysts, and I also edited books by other analysts, including, for example, Outside In, which is a fantastic book on customer experience, still very relevant today, but I was sort of their shepherd. And what I realized through that process was that it was helping people to get their ideas out into the world that was really highly motivational for me.
Over the last 9 years, Josh Bernoff has carved out a career in helping business book authors write much better books than they would have if left to their own devices. He also authored 2 books over that time, Writing Without Bullshit and Build a Better Business Book. Prior to that, for 20 years, Josh worked at Forrester Research, the global IT research company. Now, over the last year, Josh worked on a study with 4 other companies that surveyed more than 300 business book and other nonfiction authors. Their survey asked these authors about the financial returns on their investments, both in time and in money. In this episode of Everything Thought Leadership, you'll hear Josh and I discuss his career in thought leadership, the business book ROI study findings that surprised him and me the most. And from that study and his long experience in helping thought leaders to write books, Josh will explain the keys to making the thought leader and ghostwriter relationship work exceedingly well. Hey, Josh, great to have you. I've wanted to have you on our show for many years, probably longer than you might even imagine, because I've been a fond reader of your daily newsletter, which I think is amazing. I have a hard time doing one once a month, much less daily. But it's great to have you.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and thanks. I mean, thought leadership is something I think about all the time, so I'm pleased to be able to contribute some sort of insights on that.
First question. You've been both a thought leader and what I call thought leadership professional, meaning people who help thought leaders become famous or experts become famous for their ideas and eventually become recognized as quote unquote thought leaders. And you made that switch at Forrester Research, around 2009, from thought leader on what was happening in the television and other media sectors and social media, et cetera, to thought leadership professional as SVP of idea development at Forrester. You were a great analyst. Why did you switch from the analyst role to the thought leadership professional role at Forrester at that time?
So, yeah, I had the fortunate situation at Forrester to be covering the media industry during a time of enormous upheaval. For example, I made the prediction in the mid 2000s that the TV schedule would become obsolete, which was a hugely upsetting thing to many people. One guy tried to get me fired for that, but turned out to be right, right? So through that, partly because media loves to talk about itself, I became at one point the most quoted analyst in the world. Uh, and that was fun. I got to go around and give speeches and tell the CEOs of companies like CBS or Comcast what they should do. And then I'd always wanted to write a book. So I attempted to quit. I guess it would have been 2007. I told the CEO, look, I've loved working here, but I want to quit and write a book. And he had the foresight to say, well, why don't you write a book with us? Like, well, actually, I talked to Charlene Lee, who was our analyst covering social media, about writing a book about social media. And he said, oh, yeah, let's do that. Um, so I switched to becoming an author. I sort of moved my coverage to another analyst and went into hibernation and spent a year working on that book. And that also was a way to become a thought leader because Charlene and I became very well known for social media ideas. You can see the cover of that book, Groundswell, over my shoulder. And Charlene did me the wonderful favor of quitting 6 months after the book was published. So she started her own business, which was really successful. And everyone at Forrester who needed to talk to somebody, they only had me. But and that got me to all over the world. But eventually I realized that what I really loved was books, not just being an analyst. And in the time after that, I wrote more books there, collaborated on them with other analysts, and I also edited books by other analysts, including, for example, Outside In, which is a fantastic book on customer experience, still very relevant today. That was written by two other people about a topic I have no expertise in, but I was sort of their shepherd. And what I realized through that process was that it was helping people to get their ideas out into the world that was really highly motivational for me. So when I left Forrester in 2015, that was a natural thing to do. And I've worked on more than 50 books since then in various capacities and just have really loved that process. And I have to admit, at the beginning of being on my own, I was like, all right, I'm going to be a famous expert on writing and books. Well, not so much, but, but I don't miss all of the travel, and I don't miss all of the work that's necessary to be a thought leader. And I love just writing about books and helping authors. So this is good. I'm also older. When I was an analyst, I didn't have all this gray hair here. So it's a thing that you can do sitting at your desk in Portland, Maine. That's not so easy to do if you're a thought leader and you have to go give a speech in Beijing or San Francisco or Sao Paulo.
I also wonder if focusing on books enabled you to go much deeper on a topic than, say, you had the time to do when you were a Forrester analyst working on some research report on the future of the TV industry, where, I don't know, you have 3 months or 6 months to do it, and then you move on to the next topic. Books are even much more in depth, seems to me, exploration of a topic.
I don't think I agree with that. If you're an analyst covering a topic area, you need to know everything. You need to know what all the big companies are doing. You need to know what the startups are doing. You need to know about new technology trends, regulation, how it varies internationally. Every conversation that you have with a client or a technology vendor is a chance to learn more. So you actually have an enormous amount of in-depth information. And that comes up because you go into some place like Comcast and they say, well, what do you think about this? And you have to know about it. But the difference is in a book, you are compiling that into a coherent whole. So it's not just a bunch of ideas, but it is a big idea that everything stems from. And the first book I pitched was a book on the future of television that never ended up getting published, but I was still thinking of that in terms of books even then.
Well, that might be a very current today.
What I said about staying up to date is a whole lot of work. Well, my knowledge of the television industry and streaming and all of the players in there is way out of date. So no, I can't write that book anymore.
Obviously, you are part of the book publishing sector. I mean, you help
Mhm.
experts write business books. Have you dissected the book publishing industry, particularly the nonfiction, and then within nonfiction, the management books, the business books, to understand, if you were looking at that sector as you would have, say, as an analyst back at Forrester, what the heck has been happening in business book publishing?
Well, I think probably the most important trends, and this is sort of two trends that go together, are one is that authors are much more important in the visibility and publicity of their own books. So your job is to assemble the ideas. Your job is to get them into wonderful shape, possibly by hiring your own editor. And certainly, it's your job to promote the book, not the publisher's job. And concurrent with that, the publishing industry has shrunk. Um, just as an example, if you are an author who has not already published a best-selling book, the chances of your getting a business book onto the shelves at Barnes and Noble are pretty close to zero. And yet you can be very successful because that's not where people buy these kind of books. The last time you bought a business book, did you go into Barnes Noble and look at the business books on the shelf? You're like, oh, I just heard about this new book on AI. Okay, here it is on bookshop.org. Click, click, click. Now it's coming to my house, or maybe I even get the ebook and I don't even have to wait. So the result of the changes in publishing are that the advances from traditional publishers have been going down unless you're Daniel Pink, somebody with an enormous track record of success. And there are companies like Wiley that publish a lot of books, put sort of an assembly line level of effort into those books, and then hope that some of them will succeed. But as a result of that shift, these hybrid publishers have risen up, and they're basically people who say, okay, an author, we'll take care of everything for you. We'll get the book published, we'll get it into distribution, we'll get it produced, manufactured. You'll pay us to do that. And I know a number of authors have been extremely successful that way. And then you want to go a little level down, you can do self-publishing. So there's been an enormous explosion in the ability to produce these books, even as the traditional publishers have less and less resource available to help you with it.
Yeah, the hybrid publishers' books, some of them look like they could have been published by the traditional publishers, the covers.
I would say all of them do. My definition of a hybrid publisher is that someone who can produce a book that is equivalent in quality to anything that you would get from a traditional publisher. If you can tell the difference, it's not really a hybrid publisher. Um, and it's interesting. I participated recently in this business book ROI study, and we reviewed results from 300 authors who filled out the survey of uh, how they produced their books, what they invested in, and how they made money. And while it is true that the traditionally published books were more likely to be profitable and had a higher profit margin, the hybrid published books were very close. I think the lesson of that is that hybrid publishing is real. And especially if you're in a fast moving space and you want to get your book out quicker than in 12 to 15 months, you're probably better off with a hybrid publisher.
Yeah, that's why I went to Idea Press, which is a hybrid publisher, and they
Mhm.
published my book. I think it was 6 months after I delivered the final manuscript. And I didn't even go to a traditional publisher because if I had gotten a contract, it would have been a year. I think you had written about this kind of thing. It would
Mhm.
take a year, at least a year and a half before it's kind of in their
Yeah.
catalog.
They're like, okay, uh, we like your book and we want to get it to come out in spring of 2027 because that's our list that we're filling right now is spring of 2027. And you're like, no, I want people to know I'm an expert in blah, blah, blah now. So yeah, 6 months from now, you're probably still going to be that expert. But just imagine somebody who's writing a book about artificial intelligence right now and goes to, I don't know, HarperCollins or Harvard Business Press and says, let's do this book. And so if you get them to say okay to a deal, you're probably looking at coming out with this in 2026. As I speak to you at the end of 2024, what do you think AI is going to look like in 2026? Probably nothing like what you're writing about. So that's not really a good plan.
Yeah, and there may not be some of the generative AI companies that are mentioned in the book. They may not be around. All right, let's get to the study, the business book ROI study, in just a
Mhm.
second. But I want to ask you something from your book, Build a Better Business Book, a really good book. And to me, it's like this is the process that business authors should use when
Mhm.
they even think about writing a book. One of your earliest chapters, chapter 3, was about the need for great ideas, as you put in great titles. What would be your advice to a business author who came to you and you looked at what he or she had and you kind of poked and prodded and kind of, got to the essence of the idea, and it turns out to not be new at all, even though they may have examples that support it. This idea does work, but it's nothing different than what 7 other authors have said over the last 10 years. What would you tell that author?
Go away. I don't want to deal with you. No, what the truth is, okay, so for a business book to be successful, it needs to have four things. It needs to have an audience, and hey, everyone, the audience is not everyone. It should be like digital marketers or CEOs of retail companies or something like that. Um, the audience needs to have a problem. You need to have a solution to the problem. That's the idea. But the fourth thing that's equally important is differentiation. So it's not the same as the book that came out before. The truth is that when people come to me with these ideas, we often spend our time on that. What's your differentiation? And there are a lot of ways to differentiate. In fact, I think I wrote a blog post called 20 Ways to Differentiate Your Book. It could be about using new technology for this, or it could be the first book that tells the inside story of how this applied during the launching of Facebook, or it could be um, the first book that's written by a woman of color about these management issues, or a first book that's written in comic book form. I mean, there are so many ways to differentiate. So it's rare that somebody comes to me and says, "All right, I have these ideas," and I push back on them and say, "Well, what's different?" And we can't get to some sort of differentiation. Here's an example. Okay, so this is the book you just talked about, Build a Better Business Book. This is not the only book on how to write a business book. I think it's the best, but there are lots of them out there. So what was my differentiation? Well, two things. One was that this was going to be comprehensive. This is not just a book about writing; it's also about marketing and dealing with publishers and coming up with ideas and how to do an index, and I mean everything. But the second thing is there's 24 chapters in there, and that means that there's 24 stories of actual authors talking about their actual experience. And that doesn't exist. There are no books that have that much information about what it really felt like to be Lori Gassner Otting or Dan Bricklin or any of the people that I profile in there. So that's that's the differentiation. And that just goes to show that, yeah, even though I'm in a crowded market, it is unique in some ways, and that is possible to do.
Yeah, topic of my book on thought leadership, I had counted 50, at least 50 other books on Amazon with thought leadership
Oh my
in the
God.
title or subtitle, or when you looked at the title, subtitle, and you looked at the book, yeah, they're really about thought leadership. 50 others. And I think there have been a half a dozen more since I published my book almost 3 years ago. So I know well the crowded marketplace phenomena here, and they need to say something very different. So, all right, business book ROI study. I have some findings that surprised me, but I'm going to start with you. What were the, say, two or three findings, biggest findings that surprised you?
So just to sort of help people to understand, I worked with four organizations: Amplify, which is a hybrid publisher; Gotham Ghostwriters, a ghostwriting agency; um, Smith Publicity, an excellent book PR firm; and Thought Leadership Leverage, which does strategy for go to market for business authors. And so they funded this, and through all of our contacts, we managed to get 300 business authors to fill out this survey, including how they made money. That's the thing that we concentrated on, was how did they spend money and how did they make money? And sort of the big top line result is that 64% of the authors were profitable, which just means that total amount of money generated from everything like consulting and public speaking exceeded the investments that they made in things like editing and marketing. But in fact, looking at the whole survey, the thing that surprised me the most is the level of variability. So the last graphic in that report, and people can just download their own copy at authorroi.com. It's available for free. The last graphic is a log chart of expenses and income. Why a log chart? Because some people's expenses were $100 and some people's expenses were $100,000, and some people's income was $100 and some people's income was $1 million. Um, and there was definitely a correlation. The more you spend, the more likely you are to succeed. But it's not like it's a straight line. There are lots of books that spent a lot of money and didn't make money, and there are lots of books that didn't spend much money and were wildly successful. Um, and so that the things that help you to succeed here, including, having a professional editor and investing in public relations, and these are clear trends, but there is no better example of your mileage may vary than the results we got in this survey.
It was a really good study. Some of the things that stuck out for me were you'd said book sales didn't predict success or ROI, which I read as book sales didn't correlate with total return on investment. So I may sell 50,000 books, but that doesn't necessarily correlate with all the money I might generate by that book. That some 2,000 books might have a higher ROI because he or she is selling more training, consulting, speeches, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there was an interesting pattern, which is that while the traditionally published books sold more than the hybrid published books, which sold more than the self-published books. In all three cases, the amount of books that the authors thought they would sell was about twice what they actually sold. So there's a definite overestimate of how many books will sell. But if you want to understand how you're going to succeed here, it's not about whether you sell 10,000 books or 1,000 books. It's about who are those 1,000 people. And if those 1,000, let's say you're writing a book about pricing, okay, pricing strategy. That's a very obscure thing. There's probably not that many people who are experts in pricing strategy or want to know about it. But if the thing that happens is someone reads that book and says, "Oh man, I got to hire that guy. He's the expert on this." And then you end up with a, $50,000 consulting gig over the course of a year. Multiply that by 10 or 20 people and you're doing pretty well. Um, so that's how these authors succeed, and it is not correlated to the number of books that they sell. Now, it's another interesting way to look at this is we all look at these wildly successful authors, people like Malcolm Gladwell or Daniel Pink that sell millions of books. And if you're selling millions of books, you are making multiple millions of dollars from book sales. But those people are also getting $75,000 a speech. So you can still make more money speaking, even if you're making an insane amount of money from book sales.
The business author who looks at the Malcolm Gladwells and the Michael Lewis's,
Don't do that.
I want to be a multimillionaire from the sales of my book. Not likely, not likely at all, right?
Well, there are a few things. First of all, Malcolm Gladwell is insanely talented and you're not. It actually says that in my book. Like,
Yeah.
you're not Malcolm Gladwell. I'm like, if Malcolm Gladwell's reading this, I've only lied to one person. But people don't buy business books to be captivated, which is what Malcolm Gladwell does. What he does is really not that different from writing novels. People read these books not to gain enormous insight, but to be entertained. Whereas a person who buys a book on AI strategy, okay, let's take Ethan Mollick just published a book on AI, right? He's brilliant. You're not buying this book because he's a fascinating writer. You're buying this book because he's an incredible thinker and he's managed to put that into word. And, you'll see the people who buy that book, they have lots of passages underlined and little post-it notes because they really want to know what he has to say. And that's how business authors generate success.
Yeah, both really great authors. Another thing that struck me about the business book ROI study was that authors who chose hybrid publishers were 2 times as likely to be satisfied with their publishers than the authors who published with traditional publishers, the Wileys. Why do you think that's the case?
So first of all, I want to be precise about what you just said. They are twice as likely to be very satisfied. If you just look at satisfied or not satisfied, yes, the hybrid published authors are more likely to say they're satisfied, but not by that much. But
Okay.
I've worked with many authors who had traditional publishers, and their expectations of what the publisher will do for them are often really at odds with what publishers actually do. I mean, I'm working on a book right now. It's published by one of the very well known traditional publishers, and the copy editing was inadequate. So you're like, if you can't get that right, come on. Um, and especially when it comes to promotion, people's idea of what the publisher will do for you in terms of promotion is completely at odds with the amount of effort that the publisher can put in just because they're representing so many books, they don't have that much time. The hybrid publishers, this is fundamental fact. You are the customer as the author. You pay them. And as a result, they have to deliver or else they got a problem. And they do deliver because of that. Whereas at a traditional publisher, the author's not the customer. The reader isn't even the customer. The bookstore is the customer because that's who pays the money to the traditional publisher. And you, as an author, you are essential, and so is the printing, and so is the page layout. So it's a very different kind of attitude. Now, I want to caution people. There are a very small number of these hybrid publishers that I recommend Idea Press that you worked with is one. My publishers Amplify, they're fantastic. Page Two is another one that's really excellent. Greenleaf's probably the biggest and most well known. But many of these self-publishing operations say, "Oh, we're a hybrid publisher," but what they really mean is authors pay us and we put books out. The hybrid publishers have a much higher level of quality, and unless you're looking at one of those relatively small group of people, you may not be getting the service you need.
So, do you think it'd be fair to differentiate the self-publishing, the hybrid from the folks who will publish your book? That the self-publishers, they'll publish anything, and the hybrid publishers, well, the book has to be pretty good.
That's one point of differentiation, but it's not the only one.
Yeah.
So yes, the hybrid publishers are more selective than self-publishing operations, but less selective than traditional publishers. But another thing that's important is that they have an editorial philosophy. So Idea Press publishes business books, books about ideas. So does Greenleaf. So does Amplify. So does Page Two, and as a result, they have a commitment to that. But one operation I worked with called Gatekeeper Press, they do a decent job, but they also do like novels, like like romance novels, and that's fine. That's a fine business, but no, I want somebody who understands the needs of thought leaders who are publishing business books, and that means a hybrid publisher. And
Yeah.
if you look in the survey, it's very clear. While the hybrid published authors and the self-published authors are both generally profitable, more likely to be profitable, the profits from the hybrid published books are a lot higher. The profits from the self-published books are like it's like averages of $7,000, which is not very much.
Another thing in the study that stood out for me was that a very small population of authors use developmental editors, and you can explain what that means in a second. 18%, and only 8% use ghostwriters. That shocked me. A woman who was very successful in the 90s and 2000s, Donna Carpenter, you probably know her name. She ghostwrote many of Tom Peters' books, Michael Hammer's Reengineering the Corporation. She had a company called Wordsworth, used to churn out business bestseller after business bestseller. She told me once, all the best-selling business books are ghostwritten. But your research,
Absolutely not true. There are a couple of things about that. First of all, serious authors get help. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, a developmental editor is going to look at your book and say, okay, this is your ideas weak. We need to work on that. You've structured this in a way that doesn't make sense for business book. We need to work on that. Chapter one is boring, and chapter one has to be put the fear of God into you. We need to work on that. So they understand everything about books and how they work and how they're structured. And in many cases, developmental editors are doing some of the writing. And in one book that I did editing on, I basically took the entire book apart and reassembled it in a different order. Every paragraph was revised. I'm not credited as an author on that book, but I certainly put in the kind of work that an author would. Now, in other cases, the author on the cover doesn't write the book, but you shouldn't get the impression that that means that the ghostwriter conceived everything. So I have ghostwritten a book where almost all of the ideas came from me, but that was unusual. Most of the books that I've been a ghostwriter on, I am attempting to distill the ideas from the author, and they have an enormous amount of input, and you produce something and they're like, no, you got this wrong, change this around. It's more like this. There's research that has to go on. The ghostwriter may do that, the author may do that, someone working for the author may do that. So it is again a collaborative effort, but you're more than a typist, but you are less than an author. You are a writing contributor, and that can cost $20,000. That can cost $100,000. That can cost $200,000, depending on the profile of the ghostwriter and how much work they're expected to do. But I would guess that Tom Peters' books, the ideas came from Tom Peters, right? So So even if there is a ghostwriter, that doesn't mean that it's not the author's book. It just means that they had someone else do a bunch of the writing.
They were good at codifying the expert's ideas as opposed to telling the expert what to say.
Yeah. I mean, I it's interesting. So I just finished ghostwriting a book. I'm not allowed to tell you what it is, but 9/10 of the book came from the author, and I was attempting to get my head around his ideas and then put them into print, which was an enormously rewarding activity. But I was successful because he was happy with the result. The remaining 10th, I said, you should have a book on AI. You should have a chapter on AI in here. And he said, I don't know anything about AI. And I said, you know what? I'll do all of the research on this and I'll come up with something and we'll talk about it. And that was more came from me, but that doesn't mean it's not his book. He still had to look at that and say, oh, well, I think the ideas are more like this and less like that. So, no, that's not an unusual kind of collaboration like that.
Yeah, I've seen that in the work that I've done over the years. What was that old Clairol hairdresser? Only your beautician knows for sure. Another thing that struck me was that you found that posting articles on LinkedIn was the most popular social media promotional tool and the most effective, and that X/Twitter was not.
Now, I think you really need to say X sucks. Promotional tool. So we looked in the top social media tactic was posting on LinkedIn. And the second was posting on the author's own blog. And yes, these things are highly effective because we're talking about business books. But before Elon Musk took over Twitter, even then, it was very clear that it was very difficult to use it for book promotion because it was hard to get people to click through on things. It's optimized for discussion, you might just say argument, not for sharing insights. And then when Elon Musk took over, it just became a whole lot worse. And only like 33% of the people in this survey said that they used X for promotion, and half of them said it was effective, which was worse than any other tool. So, yes, give up on that and spend your time on podcasts, on LinkedIn. These are the things that make a difference.
Okay, so what do you think the biggest lessons from the study are, and from your experience? First, for the experts who maybe are not thought leaders, not recognized as thought leaders today, but that's their desire. What are the biggest implications of that research for them? What do they need? Any of them need to do differently or think differently about?
So, it's interesting. I've had some time to think about what's in the study here. And yes, there's a big idea which we didn't necessarily articulate. So the most important thing in the study is the idea that your revenue from the book will come from places other than directly from the book. It will come from speaking and consulting and workshops and courses, and in some cases, sales in your organization or even partnerships that get developed. And that doesn't happen by accident. That happens because you put together a plan ahead of time and made sure that the book fit into that. And in fact, you can see that people who had an effective revenue strategy had much higher profits than the people who didn't. We actually have that result in the survey. I realized that I could do something that we didn't publish yet, and in fact, that was in my blog yesterday, so people can look that up for that's the November 21st edition of blog at Bernoff.com. I said, all right, well, what proportion of authors' revenues came from the book, meaning advances, royalties, sale of rights, and direct sales of the book, and what proportion came from other places? And it's interesting that if you look at all of the books overall, an average of 41% came from non-book sources, which is relatively low. But if you look at people who made $10,000 or made $25,000 in profit, then it's up at 63% or 69% coming from sources other than the book. And the interpretation of this is that the more serious you are about succeeding with the book, the more your profit's going to come from places other than directly from the book sales. And again, if you look in the study, you can see that's correlated with hiring a book publicity people, in some cases hiring a ghostwriter. Basically, all of the investments in making the book a professional result are what pays off. The converse of this is do a crappy job and it's not going to succeed, right? Even if you promote it on X, still won't succeed.
What about the big lessons you think for thought leadership professionals, the editors, the ghostwriters, the marketers who thought leaders need to have a chance to have their ideas travel and become famous? What are the biggest lessons for that group?
Well, this is interesting. This is more from my experience than from the survey, but I can make two almost blanket statements about every author I've ever worked with. The first is they will almost all tell you that this was way more work than they thought it was going to be. So if you go into this thinking, oh, yeah, I'll just dash off a book. No, it turns out that there's an awful lot of conceptualization, time spent writing. You're going to have to balance between the stuff you do that generates money on a day-to-day basis and the effort that goes into the book, and then producing it and promoting it. It's a huge amount of effort. But the study also showed that 89% of the authors said that writing a book was a good idea. And that coincides with what I found by working with authors in general. When they get to the end of it, they say, wow, this was really worth doing. This distilled my thinking in a way that nothing else would. This is having an enormous impact out in the market. I'm very glad that I did this. So more work than you thought and a bigger payoff than you thought.
Yeah, I bet you that number would even go up once they a year or two out. They're getting, in companies at high places that they never would have gotten in before. Someone who said, I read your book, I really wanted to talk to you about it. And then they're getting the external affirmation that their ideas were really valuable.
There's a list of what we call soft benefits in the survey, and an overwhelming majority of people basically say, yes, this enabled me to get a higher standing, improve my reputation, and generate more influence for me.
Yeah. Different topic here. What do you think the keys are to making the thought leader slash ghostwriter slash idea developer, if the ghostwriter is both an idea developer and a wordsmith, which I think they need to be? What are the keys to making that relationship work? Because from my own experience, I've seen it work very well, and I've seen it not work very well. And I know a lot of people who would share, who have even more stories to share.
Yes. Having now ghostwritten 4 books and embarking now on a 5th one, I have very strong opinions about this. And the thing to understand is from my perspective as a ghostwriter, I'm going to spend a year working with you. It's probably going to take up half of my time for a year, and it's going to generate half of my income for the year. And man, you don't want that to be a terrible, horrible experience. So I've learned a few things. The first thing is that you want to go into it slowly. And I start with an idea development session with the authors. And part of that is to prove to them that I'm worth working with. It's a paid thing. I don't do it for free. But it's also partly because at the end of that, either of us can say, I don't think this is going to work for us. And it's much better to get out of that after having spent a month on idea development than having spent a year on a book. And there is one case that happened where it was a heavy editing project. I got like a little ways into it, and I was like, I don't agree with what this guy is saying. I can't have anything to do with this book. Sorry, this isn't for me. It's a lot of money, and I just walked away from it. The other thing is that you want to put some important things in place. That includes understanding who is going to do the research, because where's the content going to come from? Second, what is the process? I'm extremely disciplined about the process when I work with authors. So that means that we know we work on a detailed table of contents, and we know exactly what we're going to do. I know who's going to review it when I'm going to show them a fat outline for the chapter. They're going to approve that. Then I know who's going to edit it. And, the disaster is, oh, well, there's 11 people at my company who are going to trickle in their results to you, and I just keep writing bits and pieces, and we'll glue it together. It cannot work that way. So it's a question of discipline. This is a project, and you have to manage it like it's a project. And if you do it in a disciplined way where everybody knows their role and everybody behaves like a professional, that works great. In the cases where I've been successful, I would meet with the author every 1 or 2 weeks and go over these questions in detail. And that's a lot of time for somebody to put in, but that also is why those books were successful.
And I love what you've written about the fat outline, the very detailed outline. It's like, this is our map to, this is how the ideas are going to be captured and developed before somebody starts writing drafts of chapters. What about, have you ever had an author who has said, no, we don't need no outlines. Just, I'm going to talk. We'll spend 3 hours today. That'll be chapter 1. Give me the draft after that. Next week, talk 3 hours. That'll be chapter 2. Have you ever had any authors who effectively asked you to work that way? What did you do?
I have not had authors who work that way, and I wouldn't work that way. Now, I know authors who work that way with a ghostwriter. I'm thinking of one right now, and it's a really great book. It came out great. But that author was an extremely disciplined thinker who could just basically dictate the book off the top of their head. That's unusual. And let me put it this way. If you have a bunch of chaotic thoughts and you want me to assemble that into a book, which is apparently how Donald Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, came about, there are ghostwriters who will do that, and that's expensive and difficult and challenging. I just can't work that way. So yes, there are authors that are like that, and there are ghostwriters that will work for them. And, good for you. I'm too old for that crap.
All right. Last couple minutes here. Generative AI and its impact. You've written about this. I've written a little bit about this. I don't think my head is completely around it yet. What do you think the impact of generative AI at this point, from what you can see, will be over the rest of this decade on business books, on leaders especially, and the ghostwriters and the developmental editors that they choose to work with? Is it going to kill ghostwriters?
Well, I have a case in point here where I just edited a book where the author used generative AI to create a bunch of the content. And when it got to me, it was really boring. Right? Because generative AI is not known for its creativity. In fact, it is the opposite. It is the opposite of creativity. It plus you have to watch out because it makes mistakes, right? It makes stuff up. So I came away from that feeling two things. One is, oh my gosh, my job as an editor now is to make up for the deficiencies of a machine. But I also thought, oh, this is not going to replace good writers anytime soon.
But it was grammatically correct, right?
Actually, about half of it was in the passive voice.
Okay.
While that's grammatically correct, it's not very good writing.
Yeah.
That said, I use generative AI all the time, and here's what it's good for. Give me a summary of the top 5 ideas that people are talking about in this field. Read this 17-page technical paper and summarize it for me in 300 words. Okay. Read this thing that I wrote and tell me whether there are any words that are repeated more frequently than you'd expect, to the point where they might be distracting to people. So there's all these tasks that authors can use generative AI to help with. I guess what I'm thinking is it writes crappy books now. I hope that people will be able to tell the difference. It would be really embarrassing if a prominent business person, let's just say you're the CEO of a large retailer or of a large manufacturing organization, right? You or your ghostwriter use generative AI to write the book. People read it and they say, this is sort of boring. And then they check it and they're like, oh, this was written by AI. What does that do for the author? And it literally was the case in this book that I was editing where I was reading a chapter and I'm like, I don't think a human wrote this. And I asked the author and he said, no, I used generative AI to write it. I can tell, and the reader can tell too.
But I wonder if it presages an explosion of business books that would have never hit the market before generative AI. Because an author doesn't need a ghostwriter, right? The author may think, well, I don't need a ghostwriter anymore. This stuff will be write better than the author, right? Crappy writer.
Well, look, think of it as a pyramid, right? At the very top of the pyramid are the most powerful ideas that have the most success. Think of Atomic Habits. Okay, that's a fantastically powerful idea, and the book has been incredibly successful. And below that, there are like another layer of thinkers who are very influential. Clayton Christensen was one with his book about disruption, for example. And below that, there are probably, I don't know, 2, 3, 4,000 people that would be generously considered influential thought leaders. They give a lot of speeches. People pay attention to them. They're on panels. They go to all these conferences. They get quoted in the newspaper. And below that, there's maybe 10,000 other people who are influential because, I'm like the world's foremost expert on the use of AI in manufacturing or something like that. And it's always been the case that underneath that is a whole mass of undifferentiated blah, blah, blah. Just, you know, my memoir from my experience as a customer service representative. Um, so, and every other imaginable thing. And a lot of these books, they sell 19 copies and they make no influence. Now, what you've just described to me is the possibility that even below that, there's going to be a layer of mush. And if you ask me, is that going to change everything? No, mush doesn't change anything. And this is part of the reason why Amazon is now saying we won't publish AI generated books. Even Amazon is like, we'll publish almost anything, but we are not interested in mush.
You think they can tell what's AI written and not?
Well, somebody smarter than me has to answer that question.
Right?
I recently put this book that I ghost wrote through an AI detector. And I was like, uh-oh, what if it thinks I'm a machine? And it pleased me to find out that it didn't detect AI in nearly anything, except there were like 2 passages that it said were AI. And those were places where I had quoted the output from ChatGPT. So I'm like, okay, it recognized the stuff that we acknowledged came from an AI. It did find that. But the rest of it, I'm pleased to say that, I am not a robot like they say in those CAPTCHA things. I proved that I was not a robot.
So we're all safe for a while from generative AI. It's a tool, but it's a tool. It's been a useful tool. It's what I'm hearing. You found it a useful tool. I have found it a useful tool for search purposes. But yeah,
let me speak about this in the more general terms and about society as a whole. If your job is a rote thing that does not require a whole lot of creativity and thought, then you're screwed because AI is going to do your job. It's going to replace you. But what that leaves is a lot of human beings who are using their judgment to be successful. They may be in advertising, they may be in management, they may even be in accounting, but they wake up in the morning and they're like, this could actually be a little better. And they make a difference. They are not just following some pattern that was laid out, in the last 10 years in their company. And that those people, especially with the help of AI to do the rote tasks, will be successful. It's the rest of the world that I'm concerned about.
and that's a lot of people, isn't it? A lot of people in these.
Yeah, I guess so. But this is, history of technology is replacing people who do tasks that are more easily done by machines. Think about how much money does a auto worker make now? They may actually make a lot more money than they used to. There are fewer of them, and they're actually very sophisticated because they need to understand these highly technical situations that are used to build cars. Well, that's probably a model for how the world evolves. So that if you're hammering on metal, that's not a sustainable career. But if you understand how machines hammer on metal, it is.
Right. We don't have switchboard operators either, right? The old laughing character, Lily Tomlin's, and we don't have word processing pools anymore. We're using Wang for processors. So they seem to have, removed them from the workplace. Okay, Josh, this has been great. I really appreciate your expertise and your time. And I would love to bring you back in 6 months to a year and hear more about the impact of your study and your work. When that book comes out that you're going to be able to mention, you look back and talk about that.
No one will know I had anything to do with it, but I'll still have an enormous amount of pride about it. It has been great to talk to you, Bob, and let's hope that thought leadership continues to evolve in directions that are great for everybody.
Thank you, Josh. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you left a like and if you shared the episode with your colleagues. Everything Thought Leadership is a video and podcast series from Buday TLP. It's for thought leaders and thought leadership professionals, the people who help experts get recognized as thought leaders. You can find out more about Buday Thought Leadership Partners at budaytlp.com.